democracy kind of theme to it, and that'll continue for probably 2 or 3 years, if not more. We're pleased to announce the newest books in the UW Press Taiwan World Series. So, Contested Taiwan, Lev gave a presentation on that in October. And as I mentioned, Homeboy will give his presentation on the next book in April of next year. We have a couple more books in the pipeline, which I can't reveal just yet, but I would say they're very exciting, and I'll tell you more next year. For conferences, we have an agreement with Hui-nien's former visiting scholar last year, the Taiwan Studies Program, who's at the College for Indigenous Studies at National University. They will be holding a 2-year conference series, the first in National University in November this year, and the second will be here at UW. So this is something we'll plan for sometime in 27-28 academic year, maybe fall 27 year. We'll have to discuss that further. But this is something to look out for. Finally, we have an agreement with the Brookings Institution with Ryan Haas to run a Taiwan Studies and Policy Conference. This will be many years from now, so probably 2028 is my guess. But this will be an exciting kind of convergence between the policy-making world and think tanks and the academic realm. All right, that is it for my presentation. As always, if you want to keep up with what we're doing, follow us on our social media accounts, sign up for our newsletter. Before we go into our presentations, I just want to quickly highlight we have a new member of the program. I just wanted to ask Tian-Tu to just stand up and say hello to everyone. So Tian-Tu is one of our newest business scholars. He just arrived a couple weeks ago. Tian-Tu is here on the Ministry of Culture and Scholarship. So he's here.
My family just come from Taiwan, so I come this island. Island of Japan. So we connect to Japan, and then we found in Iran every long trip connect with Japan, Korea, and also other countries. So we use that and create a country called Indigenous. So this time I use this organization. So connect from Taiwan and also US. So it's my honor.
All right, thank you, Tian-Tu. So Jen will be here until July, is that right? Yeah, so a bit of a shorter visit. Feel free to reach out to Tian-Tu if you have any interest in overlap in terms of what he's studying. He'll be around. Okay, so we're going to move on now to our speaker presentations. So I've asked that the speakers speak just for 10 minutes. I realize it's very, very short, so I apologize. This is a record number of speakers. In fact, I wanted to invite a few more speakers. I really wanted Jason and Philip to speak as well. Like 8 would just be a little too many. So let me move on to, or is it a different? Go ahead. So what I'll do is I will keep time. I'm going to be very strict. So once we get to 10 minutes, I will have to ask you to step down. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers while they're coming up and getting the PowerPoint ready, just to save a little bit of time. Just a reminder, this is last opportunity to grab refreshments. I ask that everyone feel free to eat, of course, as you're watching, but grab them now while you still have the chance. So our first speaker is Bernard Chih-chieh. So Dr. Chou is professor of political science at National Tsinghua University in Tainan, in Taiwan, where he was previously chair for the Department of Political Science and Graduate Institute of Political Economy. He also directs NCKU Center for Cross-Taiwan Strait and Chinese Society's Governance. His research interests include international relations and law, East Asian political economy, cross-strait relations, human rights, political change, state-society relations. So quite a lot. But yes, Tia, go ahead, please. Let's welcome Chih-chieh.
Okay, thank you, Professor Lee. 10 minutes is really short. So thanks to the UW Taiwan Studies Programs for hosting me during this visiting scholar year. And today I want to take you on a journey through the Taiwan public opinion, especially in the Cross-Strait view. And I'd like to emphasize that this topic actually is trying to address that how people in Taiwan think about their identity, political future, and the relation with both China and the US, and how ordinary people form their own political belief in the shadow of so-called great power competition. So my talk will proceed as 5 different sessions. So you can see. The firstly, I will introduce the base of shaping the Cross-Taiwan Strait view in Taiwan, and the 2 main reasons. The first one is the internal factor. The other one is the external effect. That is geopolitics. Internal factor mainly is identity shaping. In the second session, I will show you guys the public opinion recently about the Taiwanese identity and the Taiwan's political future. Then I will add the 2 more recent drives of change, the Cross-Strait view in Taiwan. The first one is the Trump effect. The other one is the possible influence on especially young Taiwanese from the Chinese social media. And then I will provide some concluding reflection. Okay, firstly, so you guys can see that the first driving of identity change is about the legacy of the colonial rule and the Cross-Taiwan Strait separation. So during the past 6 years, we can see that the Cross-Taiwan Strait, they are different to at least jurisdiction or government across the Taiwan Strait. Okay. And so according to this map or figure, you guys can see that the Taiwan has cycled through rulers like a political revolving door. Even during the past 400 years, most of the time are under Chinese rule. Okay, but it's like a cycle through the roots. And the second identity change driver is the internal political factor. So you can see the first one is authoritarian rule, and this kind of authoritarian rule's legacy actually shaped the specific Taiwan's democratization pathway. That is, the democratization alongside the Taiwanization, or we can say the indigenization. And then further go to the so-called political independence sentiment. And the other one, of course, is about the rest and Cross-Strait in the place. And I illustrated the 3 cases. The first one is sunflower movement, then Hong Kong protesting. And then the till now is still on. There's a military test from the other side of the Taiwan Strait. And then the last one I would want to say is a kind of a sociological engine underneath everything else. That is the so-called generational replacement, especially the 4th to 6th generation. We call it democracy native. They're becoming dominant right now. So it's make the so-called Taiwan first, this kind of a doctrine, this kind of a sentiment is more become the mainstream in the public opinion in Taiwan. So right now we can say that between the 2 sides across the Taiwan Strait, maybe ethnical, cultural, the historical link is still there, but you can say the main gap is in the view of value, the social life and ideology, and the political system. Okay, and another reason to another drive of the Cross-Strait view change in Taiwan, of course, is as I said, the great powers competition between Washington and Beijing. but we can see that whatever is China or whatever is the United States, it seems that the one China concept, as well as the current Taiwan's ROC's constitution, they all have the one China conception. Even the content or the interpretation is different. Okay, so that make a kind of a framework, the framework of limitation for the public opinion in Taiwan to think about the political future of Taiwan. So that's the current Taiwan's constitution definitions, one China. Okay, and the recent tension across the Taiwan Strait is still there, especially after the elected of President Lai Ching-te, especially in the 2025, the President Lai is trying to keep his own pragmatic and independence approach. So besides that, the Chinese Communist Party is a foreign opposing force. But before that, the Beijing Labor Alliance is separatist for sure. So the tension still now across the Taiwan Strait. So now we can see the public opinion. In Taiwan, we can see it's very stable that the 2/3 Taiwanese will think it's just the Taiwanese. And the other, both, we call it dual identity, is also stable. It's about 1/3 of Taiwanese. And, but there's a little bit a sign we can see, especially here. We call it the post-sunflower movement generation, or even we can call it the Xiaohongshu generation. Okay, it's 20 to 24. They show a surprising rise in the dual identity in Taiwan. Okay, that's a very recent change. About the political future of Taiwan is also stable. That's over 60% of Taiwanese people support the status quo. Whatever status quo, go to independent, or after status quo, go to reunification, whatever. It's a 60%. Okay. So we can see that half of the Taiwanese have the pure Taiwanese identity support the status quo, and half of the pure Taiwanese identity persons support go de jure independence. Okay, so so of course the dual identity Taiwanese, the Taiwanese with the dual identity support the status quo. So that's why the 6% of Taiwanese support the status quo. Okay, that's the mainstream. And again, see about the Taiwan's political future. Again, the Xiaohongshu generation or post-sunflowers generation is a more moderate compared to the 25 to 34 cohort. So that's the Trump's effect. I would like to say that the recently after the Xi Jinping and the Trump's summit in Beijing, the Trump raised the damage statement on Taiwan. I will argue it has 3 main points. Okay, and these time limits you guys can see on the slide I wrote. 1 minute, okay. So that's a lies response. Okay, and that's a 5 policy shift. Expose Taiwan to a very shaking status. So the reflection on public opinion recently, You guys can see here the 40% of Taiwanese believe. I don't want to read out. You guys can see. So it's a very measurable effect because of the Trump. Okay, so all this is a statistical resource I collected from the maybe American think tank and the Taiwan survey, or even a foreign policy, something like that. In the second one, you can see that is another effect. It's a new effect. Is about let's see here. Okay, that means while the Trump effect is reshaping the Taiwan's attitude toward the U.S., a quieter but maybe more durable shift is happening at the platform level. As you can see here, say WeChat, Xiaohongshu, and TikTok. Okay, so there's the rest of the research. It's quite interesting. It's made by a Taiwanese scholar, but affiliated in China's university. Because here, I don't want to read out, so. And then here, the respondent express. So it seems to me the impact of social media, the migration on the Cross-Strait is a very new phenomenon, and worth us to continue to observe closely. Okay.
I'd like to invite our next speaker up, so Yang-hsun, and then Ellen will get your slides ready. Yang-hsun Ho is a PhD candidate at here at the University of Washington College of Education. They identify as queer, trans, Hokkien, and a Han Pen scholar. They grew up in Taiwan with settler and colonized family roots. Their research explores learning in social movements and community building, with particular focus on the role of emotions and affect in these learning processes. Their work mostly addresses Han settler colonialism in Taiwan, including, or in addition to addressing racism and white settler colonialism in the US. They collaborate with the Ljavek, a Taiwan indigenous community in Kaohsiung City, Taiwan, who are advocating for their residential land rights and urban spaces. Their collective work highlights indigenous self-determination in urban population. So let's welcome
Thank you. I also really want to thank first Taiwan Studies for inviting me here, and for Bernard for setting it up, because then I don't need to go through the whole history of Taiwan's colonial states. So my name is Yang-hsun, as James mentioned. I'm graduating this quarter, knock on wood. And I'd like to share a little bit about my dissertation. So the dissertation is titled Ljavek's Indigenous Urban Futurities, making some stories about learning to feel a way towards home in Taiwan's urban lands and waters. So just to begin with, I want to situate my research and my research expertise first. So I am in the field of learning sciences. So I'm really interested in how people learn. And more specifically, I'm in the subfield of learning and social movements. So I'm really curious about how people learn in protests, in organizing, in partnerships and coalitions. And the context that I'm interested in is Taiwan Studies and Indigenous Studies. So particularly how Indigenous-led social movements in Taiwan involve a lot of teaching and learning pedagogies. And even more specifically, within that, I'm really curious about how emotions play a pivotal role in this kind of learning. How do emotions like rage, grief, joy, dreaming, how do they accompany learning, especially in partaking in political action? So that's a little bit about what I'm curious about, what I'm interested in. And as James mentioned, I collaborate with an indigenous community, known as Ljavek. So Ljavek is a community based in Kaohsiung City. I cannot speak for them nor summarize them in this short amount of time, but I just want to share a few brief takeaways that will help scaffold this presentation. So Ljavek was formed in the 1950s, post-World War II. And there was this huge wave of indigenous migration towards cities and urban spaces during a time when post-World War II, Taiwan's urban development was really taking flight. So a lot of indigenous youth were moving into cities to find better job opportunities, economic opportunities, and Ljavek is no different. So that was formed because lots of Taiwan Indigenous youth are trying to find different job opportunities, economic opportunities to sustain their families. And they found space in Kaohsiung City. You can see the space shaded in green in the top black and white photo. So Ljavek actually means a large body of water in Taiwan. And it's because they found a space that was in between these two canals, and they've named themselves after these waters. And so since 1950s, it's been at least 70 years where Ljavek has perpetuated Taiwan ways of knowing, being, and their own languages. And they've also, since 1970s and 80s, experienced coerced and even forced relocation from the Kaohsiung city government. So the lands and waters that Ljavek stewards has become very economically viable. It's become very close and even, I would say, the center of Kaohsiung city. And so there's been multiple attempts from the Kaohsiung city government to incentivize people to move into public housing nearby. And there's even been really extreme cases where the city government tore down houses of Ljavek without any prior warning. So that culminated into a trial where Ljavek sued the Kaohsiung city government, and they actually won in 2023, which is a really landmark trial. And so currently, the legal trial stipulates that they have a new plot of land in Kaohsiung city. But that also means that Ljavek has to temporarily move away from their original location. So now most folks are living in public housing, their own apartments within the city and also across Taiwan as we're waiting for this new plot of land. So that's kind of the background here. So now you know a little bit about me, my research, and also the folks I collaborate with in Ljavek. I want to talk a little bit about how this dissertation research work even started. Like, how did we meet? How did this begin? So I grew up in Kaohsiung City. I was born and raised there. So when it came time for me to decide what I wanted to do for my dissertation research project, I wanted to go home, as I'm sure a lot of people might resonate with, and I wanted to learn more about my hometown and my relationship with it in a more critical perspective. So I first approached one of Ljavek's political advocacy partners, the Taiwan Association of Human Rights. They've been a strong partner throughout Ljavek's legal trial and before. And I approached them first because I wasn't really sure if Ljavek wanted to talk to an outsider about their stories, let alone a researcher, given the legacies of trauma from academia. But I felt really lucky because in 2023, when I started this work, that was just after their legal trial success. And so Ljavek was in the space of wanting to share, document, and publicize their stories. So I feel immensely grateful and privileged to be able to co-design this work with Ljavek. And I really want to give a lot of gratitude towards Galaikai Balasasao, who is a Taiwan grandmother, and the last person to move out of Ljavek's original location. And she's also been one of the main public figures in Ljavek's advocacy. So she's the second person from the left here. So most of this research data is from storytelling and conversations with her and her family. Okay. So for the interest of time, I'm only going to share a little part of one of my 3 papers for the dissertation. And I'm going to talk about this term that kept coming up in all the conversations with Galaikai, her family, with Taiwan Association of Human Rights, with activists, with lawyers. This term 团结 kept coming up again and again. And very roughly translated, 团结 can mean cohesion, unity, how tight-knit a community is. And this term came up again and again in discussions about Ljavek's urban community building. But more specifically, one particular incident really honed in this theorization of this term. It's when government officials from the Council of Indigenous Peoples actually said Ljavek was not 团结 enough. And so that's why they were displaced, and that's why they had to relocate. So in a sense, it's kind of as a way of like perpetuating blame towards Ljavek for something that was very colonial structured, right? So I'm really curious today about the theorization of 团结, both from a colonial structural perspective and also from Ljavek's own perspective from Taiwan governance. That's what I'll be focusing on. So from a colonial structural point of view, I want to share this very brief conversational snippet I had with Galaikai. So I asked her, before you had mentioned that the government officials often said that you were not 团结 enough. How did you feel after hearing that? And she said, I felt really mad, so mad. Like, you already knew that you're dividing us. Why are you still doing this? Exactly, don't you find it strange? So, as I mentioned, I'm really curious about emotions and affect, right? So to me, Galaikai's anger is really rich in knowledge and sense-making. What she's pointing out here is that the sentiment, Ljavek is not 团结 enough, actually guides Ljavik's emotions and perpetuates emotions as a colonial technology. So in the second bullet point here, you can see what I mean by this, which is the government wanted Ljavek to feel as if they were responsible for their own division, and also feel that staying in Ljavik's original location was a risky decision. So Ljavik's affect is actually pointing out these colonial technologies, right? How insidious and affectively violent the sentiment is. And she's really speaking to how critical it is to realize the sentiment has tangible impacts. Now, from Ljavik's Taiwan government's point of view, I want to mention that Galaka also said this. She said she imagines the new place, the new location from the legal trial, as a place that would 有大家, or have everyone. She meant that this place would welcome all the other community members, from those who were incentivized to move out of public housing, to those whose houses were demolished and were forced to relocate, and to those who stayed in Ljavik's original location until the legal trial ended. She's including everyone in this sentiment. And so how she's talking about community in Changji here is really different from what we just saw, and it really challenges the conception that community has to live rigidly in the same bound territory to count as a community. Instead, she's talking about visitations and relations that can still be possible, even as people live in different locations. Also, I want to note that this is perpetuating government, Taiwan governance, because Galaka is currently the eldest child of her generation, and eldest children in Taiwan governance steward the lands and waters of their families. So in a different way, she's continuing this perpetuation of Taiwan governance, even in urban spaces. And this view of Changji is then very different from other perspectives that we've just heard. So to close out, I just want to highlight a couple of things. So first of all, I want to point out how colonial struggles are affective learning. So struggles to move beyond colonial structures require learning, and that learning requires emotions and felt knowledge. Also, I want to name how, the second point here, colonial violence can operate through rigidly defined cohesion. By asking that a community has to have complete consensus all the time is actually irrational, because as we all know, any human community is heterogeneous in both opinions and circumstances. So this requirement of asking for this kind of consensus before honoring Indigenous self-determination can be really unreasonable and irrational. The last thing I want to point out is that urban Indigenous governance is constant and it is not new. So urban spaces are still lands and waters. They still hold Indigenous presences and histories. So Ljavik's Taiwan governance within Kaohsiung City is not necessarily an outlier. It's kind of just emblematic of a larger ongoing trajectory of Indigenous self-determination and migration. Those are the things I want to close out for today. And I just want to throw out a huge thank you to the guy who's on the right, and I, looking very nerdy in the center with my glasses, and my committee members, including James and for Taiwan Studies, for being able to nurture this space for us to have these critical conversations. And of course, to Ljavek and to the Taiwan Association of Human Rights for making this research even possible. So thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you so much, Yang-hsun. So our next presenter will be Hui-nien. So let me introduce Dr. Lin. Dr. Hui-nien is a visiting scholar at the University of Washington. She's been there for the past year. Associate professor in the studies of Indigenous cultural development at National Pingtung University in Taiwan. Her research focuses on Indigenous disaster governance, disaster colonialism, climate adaptation, and post-disaster reconstruction, especially in relation to Indigenous communities affected by Typhoon Monopot. So let's welcome Hui-nien. Hi, Hui-nien. Nice to meet you. So I'll just speak just
Hello, everyone. Before my presentation, I'm very grateful for all the support from over Taiwan and Taiwan Studies Program in Henry Jackson School of International Studies, and also my home institution, National Pingtung University. And I'm going to present my research at UW Management Retreat, Indigenous Sovereignty and Collective Continuity, Indigenous Climate Relocation Cases from Louisiana and Washington State. During the past 70 years, I have worked with an Indigenous community closely because of the issue Typhoon in 2009, and most of the disaster victims were Indigenous people who live in mountain area. And the reason that is so critical is because after the 20 days, the state legislate special act of reconstruction after Taiwan. And so the state have the power to designate what they call specific area, which is a hazard zone, to restrict residents for forced relocation. As a result, a total of 3575 households were relocated in 43 resettlement sites, and among them, 14 households are indigenous households. And 85% of them move away from the village as well as township, so which means that their homeland is not easily accessible for them. So there have been so many critiques after this policy. It's not only the critique of the policy, but also recently there's a lot of focus on indigenous knowledge, sovereignty, and resilience. So I found actually there are a lot of similarity between Taiwan and US. There are 3 waves of indigenous relocation, 12 tiers Indian boarding schools. In Taiwan, we have Taiwan and Shanti Pingtung. And nowadays, it's all about climate-induced relocation. And all these waves actually are based on different forms of colonialism. It's including imperialism, assimilation, and what we may call disaster colonialism. So my research here, I really want to learn more about indigenous community, how they negotiate governments and collective continually in climate relocation process. And during the past 2 quarters, I'm very fortunate to be able to be involved in different classes. And 2 of the classes are disaster related, and both of the classes mention management retreat. So I realize it is one of the US coastal adaptation strategy. So today I'm going to show you two case studies I'm trying to explore. One is Isle de Generals from Louisiana, and the other is Connaught Nation at Washington State. So what is manager retreat? It's a government buyout program. Basically, if you have flooding, or kind of issue, the government can purchase your properties, and so that you can move away from the environmental risk area. And the acquired land can be converted to green spaces or disaster buffer zones. And during the past 30 years, more than 50,000 properties have been purchased and acquired throughout this buyout program. And there has been a lot of social justice issues raised in this manager retreat, as you can see, especially for low-income and minority community, may face the disproportionate impact from this retreat policy. So the first case I'd like to share with you is Isle de Generals in Louisiana. It's right here. As you can see, it's really, really close area. And this is the new resettlement area they have been relocated. And it's about 40 miles away. And the reason that this case is so significant because it's one of the first federal funded indigenous climate relocation project in the US. And the reason that is so urgent is because 98% of this island land has been lost due to sea level rise. And many residents, during the past 20 years, many residents gradually left because of the repeated flooding. And after the long discussion, the tribe relocation vision have this vision called unification, and Yang-hsun said, 有大家, it's so similar, right? It's about they want to have a new resettlement place so that everyone who move out can be united again. And eventually they work with a nonprofit organization and they submit their grant and proposal and win the National Disaster Resilience Competition for $43.3 million for a model climate relocation project. And so, but there's a lot of sovereignty and government issue raised during this process. This tribal community actually is a multiple ethnic group. So their ancestors came from the north because of the Trails of Tears. So it's only, so they are not federal recognized, they are state recognized tribal community. And so what happened is, because they won this competition, the grant need to go through from federal government to state government. And then the state found out that the island actually have more than one tribe. So based on this, the Fair Housing Act, the state argued that the housing funding need to remain open to all islanders. So the result turned out the relocation eligibility shift from tribal membership to all island residents. And it created a lot of, and tribal leaders feel like their government authority were marginalized and really no longer reflect their original region. And so, but the state government still have some compromise along the process. Initially, the buyout program need to, if the government purchase your property, you need to turn it as a green space or buffer, disaster buffer area. But the tribal community members, they don't want the government purchase their land. They still want to have the land so that they can have their cultural right. They can be close to the ocean. So the compromise was made. Later, the residents could still retain their homes, and they can always go back if they want. Compared to Taiwan, it's totally different. Now, the indigenous people who got relocated, they are restricted to go back to their homeland, and they still have the property, but they couldn't rest them there because they have the new permanent housing at the resettlement site. But for that new housing they have, residents, if they don't have the land ownership. So the second case study is Kono in Washington State. It's right here, very close to Olympic National Park. And here is the lower village that also encounter the sea level rise issues. And so they have this kind of plan to move some of the residents to the upper main area. And it's different from the previous case. The Kono is a federal recognized indigenous nation, so they have more government authority and can negotiate directly with the federal government. And also the community co-location, it's continued for 20 years and really focus on a lot of their sovereignty and their long-term community. What I found is it's very important that the tribal community has their own funding resources to purchase the land and started this relocation planning process. And they also got support, funding support from federal government to hire their own people to have this capacity to plan along the way. So this is one of the key difference that the tribal itself, can really depend themselves to have this kind of long planning capacity. And this is their master plan. You can see that they design a lot of public places, not only the private residential area. And this is what it looks right now. The first building they built is generational building. And the focus is to take care, they definitely focus their elder care and child care would be the first priority. And also serve as like the temporary shelter if they need it. So this is some comparison. And I don't have time, so the last line I have, if you want to, sorry. Anyway, the lessons I learned from this 2 case study, I think long-term planning is really important, and relocation must retain voluntarily. And also community space, especially public spaces, are very important. And the indigenous people need to remain connected to their homeland. And also indigenous governments shape the process of relocation. And of course, their cultural right must be protected. And finally, I found that indigenous climate relocation is not simply environmental adaptation, but also a political process shaped by sovereignty, governance, and collective continuity. Thank you very much. In 10 minutes.
All right. Thank you very much, Hui-nien, for the presentation. Next, we have Tin. So Tin Bach is an undergraduate senior majoring in political science here at the University of Washington. He's also been a program assistant for the Taiwan Studies Program for the past 4 years. He is interested in diplomacy, international security, and East Asian affairs, and very recently was a business scholar at Taiwan's National Defense University, where he researched PLA military strategy, which are really topic for today's talk. So let's welcome Tim.
Yeah, thank you, James. So yeah, just a little bit more context. Yeah, I was there studying, researching, China's EMP strategy, doctorate, and doing work with a lot of the military officials there. Anyways, but this is the topic for today: China's expanding EMP arsenal and threat to Taiwan. Just to begin with, what is electromagnetic warfare? Otherwise known as EMP warfare. So essentially, these weapon systems are designed to induce electrical charges within electronics that overpower or overwhelm these systems, leading to its failure or disruption. Very basic definition. There are two main types of EMP weapons. The first is what we call high-powered microwaves, which are these essentially microwaves that are very focused and narrow and generate these beams of EMP energy and radiation that essentially disables targets and electronic systems. And the second is more more extreme. It's a high-altitude electromagnetic pulse weapon, otherwise known as the HEMP, which is a nuclear warhead that detonates at a high altitude, emitting pulses of radiation that generate these electromagnetic waves that produce the effect of EMP on a very wide scale, like hundreds of kilometers in some instances. So why is this important? The consequences of this. So as this graph shows here, essentially every aspect of our society, our economy, our way of life really is all very integrated into electronics and power systems. So without that, we are kind of just sitting ducks, and there's estimates that very disastrous estimates that millions of people would be threatened and their lives would be threatened without these electronic systems, and they're all interconnected. Meaning if one part of it really falls, everything else kind of collapses. So Richard Craig, who was the foremost expert on this EMP weapons, said it best: it's a civilizational killer, which is very much why I wanted to study this, because it's so important. Oops. China's EMP capabilities and strategy. So China is unique among, I guess, the great power adversaries in terms of their ability and their recognition of the modern threats that societies and governments face. This is very much based in kind of their historic legacies of military warfare and their strategies, where they have this emphasis on asymmetric warfare. Where they always try to look for routes where they avoid major engagements with a more superior adversary like the U.S. and seek to find ways to defeat an enemy without really facing them head on. So find these kind of shortcuts and weaknesses where they can exploit. And they, in the modern day, maybe like 2,000 years ago, would have been fire. Like I remember a chapter from Sun Tzu's Art of War, where he had a whole chapter on incendiary warfare, this asymmetric weapon system where they use fire to burn supply routes and whatnot. But I would say the modern day version of that is cyber and electromagnetic warfare. And the PLA and the Chinese government recognizes this. So in the Science and Military Strategy, which is the leading document, guiding military strategy document, they have this whole chapter on cyber electromagnetic space, and they have this statement in it where they openly state that victory in war begins victory in the cyberspace. Begins with victory in the cyberspace. So it's very strong emphasis on that. And the main reason why is because they recognize that the main weaknesses of adversaries like the United States are that we are relying on these grids, and the energy systems are all interconnected. So their main priority here is concentrating information attachments to suddenly overwhelm the enemy. and their capabilities. So I won't go too much into this. It's very technical. That's not really necessary. But suffice to say that they're very much ahead in this technology. Particularly, I would note that I mentioned at the beginning HPMs, high-powered microwave weapons, so non-nuclear EMPs. They dominate. They own Chinese companies, especially state-led. Chinese companies own 90% of all patents related to this technology. So they are, in many ways, the leaders in this technology, it shows. And then they're developing a range of these types of weapon systems. So like they even have one instance of this, where they've designed HPM weapons that are small enough to fit onto missiles that can just fly over a target and emit these radiation and whatnot. And of course, they have an expanding nuclear arsenal, plan to increase it to about 1,000 by 2035, all of which are potential HEMPs or EMP weapons and whatnot. So now moving on to Taiwan and what they're doing what they're doing, and also what their current situation is in regards to EMP resilience. So a potential scenario I kind of designed is, let's say they detonate a few nuclear weapons above Taiwan to disable all electric grids in that fashion, or they use missiles to target these little red dots with all power grids to disable electronic infrastructure. What happens then? So first of all, the first layer of defense would be missile defense systems to shoot these down. I'm not going to explain all of this, but they are not. I can say this as just a conclusion that they are not at all effective and sufficient enough to defend against thousands of missiles coming from China. They have a very limited supply, especially of PACs, our Patriot systems, which are just numbered in the hundreds, and the Americans are running out of it. So I don't know how many more they can provide in the next decade or so. So very, very limited in terms of missile defense. So the next alternative to defend against, the next layer of defense would be hardening, which is essentially basically hardening your electronics so that they can withstand EMP attacks. So the most basic way is called a Faraday cage, where you basically just cram everything into a metal box and have the metal box reflect or absorb these EMPs instead of going to the machines, or surge protectors, such as just at the beginning, at the bottom, where you basically, in the wiring, you have these little kind of filters that kind of filter out EMPs. So that's the next step. But obviously, one thing, the issue that you run into with hardening is that it's very expensive and very fast. So this is kind of a little study I did where I compared South Carolina's grid hardening initiative and kind of scaled it up to fit Taiwan. So it's not very completely accurate, but it just kind of gives you the scale of what it is. It's around $2.2 billion to harden Taiwan's grid for it to be effective to defend against EMPs. That's around 10% of Taiwan's annual defense budget, and it will probably take around over 10 years to complete because Taiwan's grid is so fast. And it probably wouldn't even be enough at that point, because we're just talking about hardening power grids. We're not talking about hardening individual electronics. There's other electronics that connect to power grids. So even this is not sufficient defense, and it's very expensive. And for that reason, I don't think it's a very politically feasible solution. And even in America and any other country in the world, no country has really effectively developed an EMP hardening strategy because of the cost, because of the time, because of the scale. Another thing Taiwan's doing successfully is an energy grid reform, where they're trying to basically decentralize the grid, creating more switching stations and distribution nodes, so that if one part of the country falls, the other parts of the country can still have electricity. And that's this process. This started in 2022, so it should be completed in 10 years. One thing I will note is that Taiwan is heading in the right direction. They have adopted more of an asymmetric stance under President Lai, and especially what is driving this is this concept called the overall defense concept, which was developed by Admiral Lee, who was a famous scholar and strategist in Taiwan, who was really leading this drive towards asymmetric capabilities. I think this quote says it all: maximum tactical impact with minimal effort. We have Taiwan has low amount. Taiwan does not have infinite amount of resources, so they have to make the most of what they have. But more relevant to this, I guess, is building on asymmetric strengths. So recognizing the weaknesses in these areas where Taiwan could possibly have vulnerabilities, and also investing in weapon systems that are not just these huge, expensive weapons that we get from America or whatnot. Investing in these small kind of areas where there could be opportunity to attack, to defend against, and also to take initiative against the Chinese. I guess policy recommendations. Very quickly, recognizing the threat EMPs are, embody is kind of the beginning stage, and it's very hard to get past that first point because there's this kind of lack of understanding of what this threat is and whatnot. I'm not going to read through it all, but since I only have 30 seconds, I will make kind of another conclusion that I've kind of developed since then, which is that EMP weapons, the Taiwanese government should be investing in them not only in its defense but also in its procurement, because it's very much also a Chinese weakness of the PLA and of China as well. So, yeah, but I'll leave it at that for the sake of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, for your presentation. Next, we have Charlie Chih, who will be presenting on something that I've become very familiar with recently, children's literature. So Charlie is a descendant of Pazi people, or Crow people, and European Americans. She is a master's student in culturally sustaining education, interested in Indigenous language and cultural revitalization, identity, and food justice. Let's welcome Charlie.
Thank you. So my presentation is called Revitalizing Gaozai, Nesting Language in Our Homes Through Children's Literature. So Dan's already introduced myself just a little bit, but so today I'm going to be talking about how I arrived at my project, a little bit about, which is the 3 children's books that I made for my master's project, a little bit about the books, and then do a short reader. So this has been a long journey of reconnecting for me. Growing up, I didn't know that my family was descended from Chih-chieh people, and it kind of started by talking to my grandparents about our family history. So my grandpa knew that his mom was Indigenous and that she spoke a different language, but he didn't know how to speak the language or what the language was called. And so I talked to my great aunt, his younger sister, about it, and she knew a little bit more. She knew the word for mother. In her mom's language, she knew that her mom was from Island Village in Hui-nien, and she knew that her last name was Pan and that everybody in the village had the same last name. So by doing a lot of research, scouring the internet, and UW libraries, eventually I was able to find my way back to Hui to meet friends, make connections, and meet relatives that I had never met before. In the process of meeting relatives, this website was shared with me, which is a family tree website. It goes all the way back to my 6th grade grandpa, so like great. And that's a picture of him. So he was a leader for Chih-chieh people, and he served as a liaison between the Cheng government and Chih-chieh people. And today, his military guard from the Cheng government is housed in the National History Museum in Taiwan. And over on the right is a family picture. In the top right is my great-grandma, who was the last person in our family to speak Chih-chieh. And in the bottom right is my dad, and he's watching online, so I wanted to shout out him. And then these are from my trips this past year to Taiwan. These are my great aunts who I was able to be connected with, who I stayed with when I was there. And this is my great uncle in the white shirt, and he is the chief editor for this Chih-chieh Mandarin dictionary, which is the Aoran Chih-chieh dictionary. So that's a spelling that was used in my children's books. And also I just wanted to say, these children's books could never have been possible without so many people, and these are just some of the people that helped me get to the place of being able to make them. So just a little bit of context and background information. Chih-chieh people are indigenous to Taiwan, originally from Hui-nien, but now live in Hui-nien, Miaoli, and Hui. And that's because in the early 1800s, there were a series of migrations due to pressures from colonialism. And during that time, my ancestors moved to Hui, so that's where my relatives who are still there live today. So Chih-chieh people are still working to gain full recognition from the government. They're not one of the 16 recognized indigenous tribes, and because of that, Chih-chieh is not offered in school-based language heritage classes or supported with the same resources as recognized Indigenous people. And so there are some conversational speakers today, but there are no longer any fluent speakers or any first language speakers. And so for my master's project, I really wanted to make materials and resources to help support language revitalization. And so when I was thinking about my book, I came across this nesting the language model, which was quite by here. And it's an idea that's adapted from language nest preschools, so I'll just explain a little bit about that for those who aren't familiar. So language nest preschools are preschools that were started by Maori people to help revitalize Maori. And so what they did was they paired elders with preschool-age children because there was a generational language gap, and who was able to speak Maori, so the parent generation was no longer able to speak. And by creating that kind of immersion environment, they made a lot of progress in revitalization. So nesting the language model is rather than nesting the children in the language, you're nesting the language in a specific area. So you're nesting it in your home. So for example, you might start by learning all the vocabulary needed in like the bathroom or the kitchen, an area with really specific vocabulary. And then over time, once you increase your competency, you can commit to only using the target language in that area. And that's really important for language revitalization situations because, like for example with Badze, people really aren't speaking it in their daily life anymore. As I said, there's no longer fluent speakers, and so that really forces you to practice the language and have a good chance to use it. And also, nesting the language in the home can be done by anyone, anywhere, and you don't need a lot of resources or tools to get started. So based off of that idea, I made these 3 books. So 2 of them focus on kitchen vocabulary. One is a counting book, so counting using kitchen items, and then the other one is a story that happens in the kitchen, and then the last one focuses on bedtime routine and bathroom vocabulary. And so all the books use really simple sentence structure. I really wanted it to be so that parents could kind of learn alongside their children and then have some phrases to get started in creating the language. So I wanted to shout out to all the awesome people who helped me translate, and I couldn't have done it without them. And so Katie did the Mandarin translations, Kim Boone did Badze translations and revisions and Mandarin revisions, and Savon and Fabilia worked on Badze translations for the council book. Okay. So I'm going to share a short reading from the book. So Kim Boone and I pre-recorded it, so she read the Badze and I read the English.
Let's make dinner. Hi, I'm Balia. Today, our relatives are coming. We will eat dinner together. I'm so excited. Dad is cooking. Balia, come help.
How?
Okay. I wash my hands. I help Dad cook. We prepare the moss. And fern.
Apakah Mushina Balozak?
Dad stir fries pork.
Ini nika tupang ako kae.
It smells so good.
Kita ka tehalama luhut inumas.
We steam pickled deer.
Aku ka pisumay.
I cook rice.
Yes, I just wanted to share a quick excerpt from that. And in case you're interested in knowing when the books are printed and available, feel free to use the QR code to give me your email and I'll let you know. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Charlie. And I think if it's okay, we might save this QR code for like distribution, like mail, social media. I will also be filling out one of those forms. All right, our final presenter is Margaret Du. And Margaret, I will let you share your own name in just a minute. So Margaret is a PhD candidate in law at the University of Washington, coming from a mixed background that includes Indigenous Chih-chieh people of Taiwan. She researches law, technology, and Indigenous studies with a focus on data sovereignty, artificial intelligence, and self-determination. So let's welcome Margaret.
Thank you so much, everyone. And I also see many of my students over here. Yay, thank you so much. And my pleasure to be here today to share part of my PhD dissertation. So my focus will be practices of Indigenous self-determination in cultural and digital governance. So the core of my research is about Indigenous self-determinance because I personally dear this topic. I'm coming from the Taiwanese Indigenous community in America. And I'm also coming from a mixed background family. So today when we have the brief colonial history of Taiwan, and so I also want to share a very brief colonial history of Taiwan from the perspective of Indigenous peoples. So for example, the names of my family. So first we have our Indigenous name. James gave me this chance to share my Indigenous name with you. It's Nikat Kabalaan. So Nikat is my first name and Kabalaan is my family name. But this Indigenous name, this Indigenous surname didn't last very long because in my great-grandfathers, in their generation, because of Japanese colonization, they started to change their surname into Sakata, into a Japanese surname. And then it comes to my father's generation when the Chinese nationalist Pingtung or KMT came to Taiwan. Our family forced to change our surname again into Du, Mu to Du. So Mu to Du combines these two. My grandfather and their siblings choose this surname because they think that Mu is wood or forest, Tu is earth, and is more close to the land. So they kind of have this freedom, a little bit freedom to their surname. But not every community of the Indigenous people can change their name like that. For example, Charlie mentioned that many of the Indigenous people were named Pan because many of the Indigenous family just designate Pan as their surname with their household registration. So after that is my generation. I was born in 1990. So in Berna's presentation, I was in the 6th group because he categorized the group and I was in the 6th. So when I was born in Taipei, the capital city of Taiwan, I'm an urban Indigenous person and I don't have this close relationships to the tribal community, but I gradually try to find my way back. So it's a similar story like Charlie. And so my generation, we also have the DPP, the Democratic Party, to be the leading party. So more advocacy to the Indigenous community, I would say, and also transitional justice and so many things going on. But still, they are not mean that Indigenous community or Indigenous person in Taiwan, we have all the freedom or all the rights we got. So that's why as a law school student, I want to try to find more engagement to Indigenous self-determination rights because I think it is really the time for Indigenous communities or Indigenous peoples or like me, an Indigenous scholar, to do something for myself and my people. So for my dissertation, I got my research question is that now in Taiwan, we already have some laws and regulations regarding to indigenous people's rights, like the rule of laws. But what are these legal rights and what are the mechanisms of protection available? And my focus will be mainly on cultural rights, because many times the existence of indigenous peoples, especially our culture, sometimes represent the multicultural of Taiwan. Yeah, and so that's one question, but I also want to switch to another more timely issue is about indigenous data sovereignty. And why I want to combine these two together is because I think for indigenous people, our cultural misuse or misappropriation not only take place in physical spaces or in any other spaces, but also online. So I also want to use this chance to take a look. So it's a very brief roadmap of my dissertation. So first, I just want to share why I want to go into this research, which I just very briefly share with you. And in my chapter 2, I go into details about the short story I share with you, the colonial history of Taiwan, and using Taiwan indigenous people as our perspective. In the third chapter, I go into museum and library and curatorial practice, and I'll show with you very briefly later. For my chapter 4 is about indigenous data sovereignty, and chapter 5 and 6 is more like a synchronizing conclusion. So for me, why I want to use a whole chapter in chapter 2 talking about my family history is because I think these things are all come together. So for me, writing this dissertation is more like an autoethnography as well, because for so long, indigenous people were research objects. We were researched by other people, other researchers. But what about this time when I can research myself and also my people, and maybe share some voices really from ourselves? So I already shared with you that brief history of my name, so I think I'll just skip this one. But from the interesting of time, if we go to my chapter 3, when I talk about the physical spaces, how we practice indigenous self-determination rights. So I use the example of my curation at the Berkeley Museum. So that was back in 2023, because I passed my general exam back in 2022. By the time I was a second-year PhD student. And so when I passed this, I think, okay, now I kind of have a little bit freedom on my own hands to do something I want. So that's why I got this wonderful chance to be collaborate with another UW alumni, Dr. Jun. So he's from the UW Department of Anthropology, and he's an archaeologist. And so he has his expertise, and I'm from the School of Law, and I'm also coming from the indigenous community. So we got this wonderful chance to revisit the indigenous culture holdings store at the Berkeley Museum from Taiwan for so long time. And most of that cultural holdings were taken by George Kerr from Taiwan when Taiwan was colonized by Japan. Okay, so that curatorial experience is something I think for me as a practice of how indigenous scholars or in this generation, we are trying to using the material culture or cultural holding to know ourselves more and also know our people, and also as an invitation to the to non-indigenous communities to learn more about Taiwan and also indigenous studies. And another thing I'm very proudly is my course. So this spring quarter course I offered the Indigenous Taiwan and Pacific Connection, Law, Culture, and Literature is also for myself a very dear way of indigenous self-determination, because I can be the instructor to share my knowledge, my personal experience with my students, and also to learn their feedback, their suggestions, and in our final presentation, I invite them to actually share their own culture, because I don't want people to just duplicate indigenous cultures and make into an exhibition or a presentation. No, I want them to, because they have learned from me the whole quarter. So using my course as a lens to know better of themselves. Because I think only when more people are knowing themselves, they walk this journey, they can then understand. They can then understand the journey I'm walking. Why I want to know myself more, why I want to advocate more about indigenous rights. Once you know that you actually might have the similar experience. Okay, so moving very fast to my chapter 4, when I switch into indigenous data sovereignty, it's basically the same idea. It is because these two pictures I also shared in my class. On the right side is called Haya. It's a virtual AI created, generated indigenous figure. So it's similar to indigenous people, but not true. And on the other side is two pictures posted on Threads, another social media that lots of people use. So these are all AI generated indigenous figures. So these are not real indigenous person, but they just put the cultural expressions together and make it to it. But what worse is that they also make some text saying particular political ideology. But that is not true. So all these things, I just want to come back the core idea. Why other people trying to say something about indigenous people, but not authentic voices? So that's why I think this tool, no matter it's in the physical, like museum or library or other research about indigenous people or any of these social media posts online, we don't see the real voices from indigenous peoples. So that's why I want to put into my research. And so coming to the concluding thoughts, I just want to advocate that indigenous self-determination, we move across institutional or digital spaces. So for me, AI governance, this kind of like technological issue is also a cultural governance because we want to have an authentic voice. And then culture is always a living thing, a relational thing. And I just want to say that in self-determination begin with recognition, as we already have law, but it also must be built through practice, and like what I've done now, and also what all of you are listening today. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Margaret. I'd like to invite all of our presenters to come up to sit here. So for the next we're a little bit behind schedule. The next 10 minutes, I apologize. We're going to do a very, very quick Q&A. Yeah, everyone come up here. I will help moderate. I think what I'll do is, because we have 6 presenters, I'm going to take maybe 2 or 3 questions at once, and then I will allow our presenters to answer as a round together. And then we can probably do that second round. Or we can leave this out. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Okay, questions for our presenters? Justin?
Thank you all for the basic research. So I guess my curiosity is like where and particularly for indigenous research, like what next, right? Where is like cultural, ethnography, policy work, where like what's next? Like the community goes facing like other also pressing issues here. Defense and security policy, more on economic, right? All the other pressing issues society.
Do you need to repeat the question for online? Okay, so the question from Justin is asking all of our Indigenous speakers and researchers, what's next? What would you recommend in terms of, I guess, policy for Taiwan society to consider based on your own research? Let me take maybe 1 or 2 more questions before I ask our audience to answer. Any other questions? No? Okay, well, let me ask our presenters today. So this is one that I think many of you will have thoughts on. So. Anyone want to go first? Margaret?
Oh, okay, so Taiwan War, it was 17 years, and there's so many protests along the way. And last year, we have another disaster in Fatan. And I have to say that I feel like this is like a multiple ways of protest and advocacy. So the policy slightly change in the issue of Matana. Of course, now they still fight very hard because they really want to participate along the planning process, but it has not happened right now. They still, I think 2 days ago, they still have this news, another movement trying to showcase their willingness. They really want to participate in the planning process. So, I really learned that it's not only about advocacy, it's the capacity that Indigenous people have all kind of support and resources to be able to build this political capacity to move along the way. And I really admire what they have done. And, Mataan people, they are not alone. They got a lot of support also from a lot of NGOs and university as well. And, I'm here, so during the past year, I can only get some information through online resources, so I don't know much about it, and I really want to learn more about from them after I go back to Taiwan.
I guess I'll just highlight the push for recognition for Pingtung Indigenous people and Pathé people and other Pingtung Indigenous people. I think hopefully once that happens, there will be more resources for, language revitalization and other issues.
I think one thing, because of time, there's so much to the stories that I'm sure everyone could have shared so much more. But another thing to mention is one of the reasons that Kaohsiung City's lands and waters have become so urgently a part of urban planning is because Kaohsiung City is trying to rebrand itself as a new Bay Area. And so really focusing on technologies. And I want to say this with a lot of realistic kind of observations, right? Taiwan is pushing for this because ultimately being a semiconductor and AI, notably a semiconductor and an AI contributor, is really important for Taiwan to maintain sovereignty and to be safe in the face of so many different threats. But I think at the same time, there needs to be a conversation around how these projects oftentimes come at the cost of eroding Indigenous lands and waters and Indigenous stewardship. And I don't think this has been talked about enough. A lot of times when we're talking about threats of sovereignty, it's often between China, US, and Taiwan. But the Indigenous sovereignties, the many, many Indigenous sovereignties in Taiwan are missed out on that conversation. And I don't say this in a sense to just be thinking about equity or things of giving everyone the same stakeholdership, but also in the sense of there's a lot of wisdom in how we can be in better relation with environments, especially thinking about climate change and crises that we need to learn alongside Indigenous sovereignties, and that's missing out if we do not consider these sovereignties on the same footing in that way. Yeah, so I'll add that.
Thank you so much for this question. And so I think one thing I will recommend is that having more engagement or relationship with the Indigenous community. So I really like when all of you, when you share your study, you share with the audience why you want to do these studies. So for Professor Hui-nien, because you are living really closely to the Indigenous community, and for Charlie is because you're family, and so for Yang-hsun is also because your hometown is there. So this is all relationship. So because you acknowledge this relationship, either with the community, with the land or the water, so you know that is important to you. So I think for non-Indigenous community in Taiwan, sometimes we don't want to have this tension all the time, like indigenous people and non-indigenous people thinking that we are enemies, or thinking that, especially for the extra credit for indigenous kids, so people will think that why indigenous people in Taiwan can take so many benefits. And so similar things, when you know indigenous people are, for example, me, we are just here, we are just other people living on this island as well, and we have our family and our own life journey, then it will be easier for us to think of a common good way when we all live in Taiwan now. So especially for myself, I'm coming from a mixed background. So my family also have 本省人、外省人 and other ethnic group of Taiwan. So sometimes I don't want to just keep advocating indigenous rights and saying that other people are better or something, because other people are also my family. So if you have a vision of Taiwan, we all have to figure out something that we can work together, but not sacrifice indigenous community in some ways, when sometimes there's a narrative saying that indigenous people, you have to, you don't complain that much, because now what is more serious is about national security, or like national security or something like more life-threatening things like that. It is very important to devote resources to these other issues that is really concern Taiwanese people's future. But at the same time, the voices of indigenous people, the needs of indigenous people is also crucial, because only when you can take care of everyone on this island, we can move forward together. So that would be my answer to that. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, other questions? Bill?
So last week I especially introduced communities of actually Taiwan's population identifies as indigenous is rather small. And yet, the portion of Taiwan's population that actually has indigenous ancestors is quite large. So I'm wondering if you think outside of indigenous communities, what extent can like broader raising consciousness of indigenous ancestry actually alter Taiwan's value and be beneficial to indigenous communities as well as maybe important related to more of the Taiwan.
Let me repeat the question from Bill. So Bill points out that the number of people who are classified as indigenous in Taiwan is a very small number, but many people in Taiwan who are not indigenous trace their ancestry to indigenous roots. So what way is there to kind of build on that, to broaden the recognition of indigenous ancestry to help shape contemporary Taiwanese social identity? Any other questions? Yes. So a question for Charlie, kind of plans for publication, and if you want to sell them online or in bookstores. And then if I could just ask one question for Chih-chieh. I'm very interested in the generational change that we're seeing, especially in the post-Landwater generation, so under 30 generation. I recently came from a conference where one of the presenters presented on Chih-chieh, which is something that I learned just recently, so Chih-chieh, and talking about language that comes from, ostensibly from places like Chou, from TikTok, Douyin, so platforms that originate in the PRC. Does the change there's a slight uptick, so from 2% to 6% uptick in dual Taiwanese Chinese identity. Should we attribute this to the increase in consumption of popular culture from China, or are there other reasons, maybe tied with economic conditions or politics, I know that the young generation is particularly supportive of Pingtung, and I don't know if there's a kind of political bent to this as well. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about that. I think we can take maybe one more question together, and then this will be the last one. Go ahead.
So I'm sure that's part of where the study at Canada that honestly, how you which has been largely criticized by other administrators as being poorly treated because of the link between Southern China and the rest of Southeast Asia. How do you, Margaret, think that relates to your theory of Indigenous data on the topic? I guess because of the Pingtung's whole, argument about the federal predestined and
Okay, just to repeat the question. So there's a particularly problematic study, which Margaret can tell us a little bit more about. How does that kind of affect your conception or thoughts about Indigenous science? So we only have a few minutes left. I think I'd probably ask maybe just about 1 minute in your responses, if that's okay. And we can start the situation just as you responded before. It's on.
Okay, thank you for James' question. I think, I think your questions are excellent because I agree with you. They possibly another substantial factor to influence on this kind of post-Taiwanese generation, their identity or their feeling about Taiwan's medical future. Because even in the research I mentioned in my presentation, is a strong correlation, but correlation is not equal to the causality. Yeah, but conversely, the survey in my presentation also showed that, as you mentioned, the TPP's main supporter actually a young person. Yeah, they like PD or something like that, and their shift about their identity and their sentiment about Taiwan's political future is huge in the recent years. So I think that's possible the reason for except for the Chinese social medias, their effect. I mean, the rise of the TPP or TPP's supporter, I think, is another indicator for sure. Yeah, but I think my point is that I think the young generation, they are very pragmatic and smart. I think their bottom line is peace, is their own career. To some degree, they feel sick about the politics and the politician, whatever in Taiwan or in China or between Washington and Beijing. Okay, so and Taiwanese people, we cannot decide our future just by our vote. It still depends on the great competition. So I think it's a possible kind of a political alienation is getting strong in the young generation. And when they face the pop culture, they can build a kind of a community belonging across the Taiwan Strait. Maybe they will feel that culture go first, the political go later, something like that. Okay, that's my 2 cents.
I think I can combine, and Nicholas is my student, and thank you, Bill, for this question. I think I can try to combine these 2 questions together. I think when it comes to this idea of kind of like claiming the indigenous identity in Taiwan now because of this history that maybe one of your grandmother or other people is from the indigenous communities, kind of like become a way popular ideology given this tension between Taiwan and China. But I think from the voices of indigenous community, we will say that if you want to claim this identity, first you have to know us better. Like you have to know, because for example, myself, being an indigenous people is not we just born to be indigenous people sometimes. It's a very tricky way to say that. We were born as indigenous people, but when you claim yourself as an indigenous people, you also have responsibilities. You want to know how to be an indigenous person, especially for my community, the Taiwanese people. We say "sakaratan." It means that how you become a person. And how you become a person, meaning that you have to know the knowledge, the wisdom of Taiwanese, an indigenous person. So I think for myself, I would also maybe for having this curation exhibition or teaching this class, I always say that is an invitation because I want people to know more about Taiwan indigenous community. And so when you have this basic knowledge, you know better and you also have this responsibility because now you know. Now you are not just purely innocence. So if you want to claim this identity, I don't think too many indigenous people will say no to you once you have done your homework, once you have known us better, once you know how to respect, or once you know more knowledge how to be indigenous people. So thank you for this question. Thank you.
I would like to publish somehow the books and have them available for people to buy. I am trying to figure out the best way to do that. So if anyone has any idea of how I should do that, feel free to come talk to me. I also did bring like a printed version of the books. So if you want to look at them after, you're welcome to can make them out here or something.
So I'll answer, Bill, your question. First of all, I want to just thank you because I think it is very important for us to think about ways to move towards solidarity, even if we don't share identity. So I hear that in your question, and I really appreciate that. I also really fully agree with Margaret. So in the US, there are a lot of ways to gain tribal nation memberships, such as like blood quantum and ancestry. And through these experiences, we've learned how it's easily co-opted and becomes like taken advantage of, and it's very easily becomes problematic very quickly. People trying to claim certain benefits and welfare without really participating in any responsibilities within the tribal nations here. So I think the blood ancestry conversation, we've seen it can start out with good intention, but we've seen historically how it can very quickly go down a path that we didn't intend it to and we don't want it to. So I think instead there's a lot of ways I think we can think about solidarity and think about honoring indigenous sovereignties in a very different ways. Like for example, I think speaking for myself as like someone who's Hokkien and Hula, I really think there's a need for us to rethink what being Hula means. So like in a way that thinks about Hula not as like an ethnic dominant group or like perpetuating ethnic dominance within Taiwan, but as like an identity that thinks more about our relations with environments and lands and waters. And that brings me a lot of comfort, honestly, especially with the threats ongoing, geopolitical tensions that have started even before I was born, that I've lived through and embodied very viscerally. Understanding myself as Hula and tied to Taiwan's lands and waters rather than being a citizen brings a lot of comfort and a lot of reassurance. So it becomes a stronger identity for me personally to think about my relations with indigenous sovereignties and Taiwan's many islands, lands, and waters in that way. I think it's very important for us to continue thinking about this conversation of solidarity, but what ways can we think about our identity, our relations that both honors indigenous sovereignties while not going down specific paths that might be co-opted or might be taken advantage of. I also want to name that like there are also openings for us to think about so many different groups in Taiwan have experienced colonization. It's not always the same experiences. Honestly, it's not the same experience in terms of scale and in terms of experience, but there is potentially some opening there to think about solidarity while noticing there are nuances to those different colonized experiences as well. So I'll end it there and like thank you everyone for listening and sharing your questions. Yeah.
Any other comments before we conclude? No? Okay, let's give a round of applause to our presenters. Thank you so much for presenting your research and for the deep thoughts to our questions from the audience. If I could just have 5 more minutes of your time, I'd just like to do a little bit of a ceremony just because so many members of the Taiwan Studies community will be leaving us this year. And I just want to take a moment to celebrate this. We have some mugs. I'd like to give to our graduating students. So, like, I can't even imagine a Taiwan Studies community without Yang-hsun, without Margaret. Ellen Eskenazi is also leaving us very sadly. And so this is a very difficult moment for me personally to lose so many members of our community. But it's also very sweet because I'm very happy that, like Margaret and Yang-hsun, we're going on to postdoctoral positions and continue careers. So many will continue on to great things in their academic careers and professional careers. But let's at least take this moment to celebrate. If I could give some of these, how should I do this? All right. Yeah, what would you Okay, sorry. Thank you all. I also wanted to celebrate Chih-chieh, who is our Army War College Fellow, who wrote a fantastic paper on Taiwanese defense. So, as an honorary member, I'd like to Okay. So thank you so much, Ellen, for getting cake. The rest of the session, I know we only have like 5 minutes left. The rest of the session is a free social, so have some cake, have some more sandwiches. Feel free to mingle, ask more questions, and also celebrate our graduating students. Thank you so much for spending this time with us.